Hi guys, we are in the middle of trying to understand Rishi Aurobindo's philosophies from his book The Life Divine, and today we start the 13th chapter called The Divine Maya. It starts with a quote from the Rig Veda. By the names of the Lord and hers, they shaped and measured the force of the Mother of Light. Wearing might after might of that force as a robe, the lords of Maya shaped out form in this being. The masters of Maya shaped all by his Maya. The fathers who have divine vision set him within as a child that is to be born. Now Rishi Aurobindo writes, existence that acts and creates by the power and from the pure delight of its conscious being is the reality that we are, the self of all our modes and moods, the cause, object and goal of all our doing, becoming and creating. As the poet, artist or musician, when he creates, does really nothing but develop some potentiality in his unmanifested self into a form of manifestation, and as the thinker, statesman, mechanist only bring out into a shape of things that which lay hidden in themselves, was themselves, is still themselves when it is cast into form. So is it with the world and the eternal. All creation or becoming is nothing but this self-manifestation. Out of the seed there evolves that which is already in the seed, pre-existent in being, predestined in its will to become, prearranged in the delight of becoming. The original plasm held in itself in force of being the resultant organism. So whatever you do is already inside you. Whatever exists, its potential has already been created when you were created. What doesn't exist cannot be created by you. If you create a melody, it doesn't mean you created the melody was inside you in some way or the other. For it is always that secret, burdened, self-knowing force which labors under its own irresistible impulse to manifest the form of itself with which it is charged. Manifestation means the final execution of the thing you are imagining in your mind. Only the individual who creates or develops out of himself makes a distinction between himself, the force that works in him, and the material in which he works. In reality, the force is himself. The individualized consciousness which it instrumentalizes is himself. The material which it uses is himself. The resultant form is himself. In other words, it is one existence, one force, one delight of being which concentrates itself at various points, says of each, "This is I," and works in it by a various play of self-force for a various play of self-formation. What it produces is itself and can be nothing other than itself, what I just said. What it produces is itself and can be nothing other than itself. It is working out a play, a rhythm, a development of its own existence, force of consciousness and delight of being. Therefore, whatever comes into the world seeks nothing but this, to be, to arrive at the intended form, to enlarge its self-existence in that form, to develop, manifest, increase, realize infinitely the consciousness and the power that is in it, to have the delight of coming into manifestation, the delight of the form of being, the delight of the rhythm of consciousness, the delight of the play of force, and to aggrandize and perfect that delight by whatever means is possible, in whatever direction, through whatever idea of itself may be suggested to it by the existence, the conscious force, the delight, active within its deepest being. And if there is any goal, any completeness towards which things tend, it can only be the completeness in the individual and in the whole which the individuals constitute, of its self-existence, of its power and consciousness, and of its delight of being. But such completeness is not possible in the individual consciousness concentrated within the limits of the individual formation. Absolute completeness is not feasible in the finite because it is alien to the self-conception of the finite. What a beautiful sentence. Absolute completeness is not feasible in the finite because it is alien to the self-conception of the finite. Therefore, the only final goal possible is the emergence of the infinite consciousness in the individual. It is his recovery of the truth of himself by self-knowledge and self-realization, the truth of the infinite in being, the infinite in consciousness, the infinite in delight, repossessed as his own self and reality, of which the finite is only a mask and an instrument for various expression. Thus, by the very nature of the world play as it has been realized by the Satchidananda in the vastness of his existence, extended as space and time, we have to conceive first of an involution and a self-absorption of conscious being into the density and infinite divisibility of substance, because otherwise there can be no finite variation. Next, an emergence of the self-imprisoned force into formal being, living being, thinking being, and finally a release of the formed thinking being into the free realization of itself as the one and the infinite. Being into the free realization of itself as the one and the infinite at play in the world, and by the release its recovery of the boundless existence consciousness bliss, which means Satchidananda, Sat, Chit and Ananda, existence consciousness bliss. It's said in one phrase. So let me read out this sentence once again. Where did it start? Okay, it started in the previous page. This book has some long sentences. Thus, by the very nature of the world play, as it has been realized by Satchidananda in the vastness of his existence, extended as space and time, we have to conceive first of an involution and a self-absorption of conscious being into the density and infinite divisibility of substance, because otherwise there can be no finite variation. Next, an emergence of the self-imprisoned force into formal being, living being, thinking being. So emergence of the self-imprisoned force into formal being, into a living being, into a thinking being, and finally a release of the formed thinking being into the free realization of itself as the one and the infinite at play in the world, and by the release its recovery of the boundless existence consciousness bliss, that even now it is secretly, really and eternally. It is still that thing. It is still secretly, and it is still really, and it is still eternally. This triple movement is the whole key of the world enigma. It is so that the ancient and eternal truth of Vedanta receives into itself and illumines, justifies, and shows us all the meaning of the modern and phenomenal truth of evolution in the universe. And it is so only that this modern truth of evolution, which is the old truth of the universal developing itself successively in time, seen opaquely through the study of force and matter, can find its own full sense and justification, by illuminating itself with the light of the ancient and eternal truth still preserved for us in the Vedantic scriptures. To this mutual self-discovery and self-illumination by the fusion of the old Eastern and the new Western knowledge, the thought of the world is already turning. I have to underline this sentence because it's beautiful and very important. By illuminating itself with the light of the ancient and eternal truth still preserved for us in the Vedantic scriptures. To this mutual self-discovery and self-illumination by the fusion of the old Eastern and the new Western knowledge, the thought of the world is already turning. Still, when we have found that all things are Satchidananda, all has not yet been explained. We know the reality of the universe. We do not yet know the process by which that reality has turned itself into this phenomenon. We have the key of the riddle. We have still to find the lock in which it will turn. This is a nice analogy. For this existence, because this existence, conscious force, delight does not existence, conscious force and delight does not work directly or with a sovereign irresponsibility, like a magician building up worlds and universes by the mere fiat of its word. We perceive a process. We are aware of a law. This is very important, because I think this sentence is one of the main concepts which differentiates Sanatan Dharma from Abrahamic religions. Because see what Rishi Aurobindo is saying. We have the key of the riddle, we don't have the lock. Because this existence, conscious force, delight, they do not work directly or with a sovereign irresponsibility, as if a magician is building up worlds and universes by the mere fiat of its word. We perceive a process. We are aware of a law. We are searching for, and we are looking for, and we know that there is a framework. Framework is the more modern word for this concept. We are operating inside a framework, we know that, and we just need to explore the details. It is true that this law, when we analyze it, seems to resolve itself into an equilibrium of the play of forces and a determination of that play into fixed lines of working by the accident of development and the habit of past realized energy. But this apparent and secondary truth is final to us only so long as we conceive of force solely. But this apparent and secondary truth is final to us only so long as we conceive of force alone. When we conceive of force in isolation, when we perceive that force is a self-expression of existence, we are bound to perceive also that this line which force has taken corresponds to some self-truth of that existence which governs and determines its constant curve and destination. And since consciousness is the nature of the original existence and the essence of its force, this truth must be a self-perception in conscious being, and this determination of the line taken by force must result from a power of self-directive knowledge inherent in consciousness, which enables it power of self-directive knowledge which is inherent in consciousness, which enables it to guide its own force inevitably along the logical line of the original self-perception. It is then a self-determining power in universal consciousness, a capacity in self-awareness of infinite existence to perceive a certain truth in itself and direct its force of creation along the line of that truth which has presided over the cosmic manifestation. But why should we interpose any special power or faculty between the infinite consciousness itself and the result of its workings? Listen to this question again. But why should we interpose any special power or faculty between the infinite consciousness itself and the result of its workings? May not this self-awareness of the infinite range freely, creating forms which afterwards remain in play so long as there is not the fiat that bids them cease? Okay, this sentence is a bit complex. So the question was raised. Now the answer, an additional follow-up question is that, may not this self-awareness of the infinite range freely, creating forms which afterwards remain in place so long as there is not the fiat that bids them cease? Even as the old Semitic revelation tells us, God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. But when we say God said, "Let there be light," we assume the act of a power of consciousness which determines light out of everything else that is not light. And when we say, "and there was light," we presume a directing faculty, an active power corresponding to the original perceptive power, which brings out the phenomenon, and working out light according to the line of the original perception, prevents it from being overpowered by all the infinite possibilities that are other than itself. Infinite consciousness in its infinite action can produce only infinite results. To settle upon a fixed truth or order of truths and build a world in conformity with that which is fixed demands a selective faculty of knowledge commissioned to shape finite appearance out of the infinite reality. This is obvious that he is talking about Abrahamic religions now. So according to me, what he is saying about Abrahamic faiths is that infinite consciousness in its infinite action can produce only infinite results, which kind of Sanatan Dharma is talking about. But to settle upon a fixed truth or order of truths and build a world in conformity with that which is fixed, that this sort of thinking demands a selective faculty of knowledge, not the whole, you pick and choose, demands a selective faculty of knowledge commissioned to shape finite appearance out of an infinite reality. This power was known to the Vedic seers by the name of Maya. Maya meant for them the power of infinite consciousness to comprehend, contain in itself, and measure out, that is to say, to form, because form is delimitation. Interesting. Form is delimitation, name and shape out of the vast, illimitable truth of infinite existence. This sentence got a bit complex. This power was known to the Vedic seers by the name of Maya. Maya meant for them the power of infinite consciousness to comprehend, contain in itself, and measure out, that is to say to form, because form is delimitation. To form what? That is to say to form the name and shape out of the vast, illimitable truth of infinite existence. Okay. It is by Maya that static truth of essential being becomes ordered truth of active being. Ah, what a beautiful sentence. Static truth of essential being becomes ordered truth of active being, or to put it in more metaphysical language, out of the supreme being in which all is all without barrier of separative consciousness emerges the phenomenal, out of the supreme being in which all is all without barrier of separative consciousness emerges that phenomenal being in which all is in each and each is in all, for the play of existence with existence, consciousness with consciousness, force with force, delight with delight. This play of all in each and each in all is concealed at first from us by the mental play or the illusion of Maya, which persuades each that he is in all but not all in him, and that he is in all as a separated being, not as a being always inseparably one with the rest of existence. Afterwards, we have to emerge from this error into the supramental play or the truth of Maya, where the each and the all coexist in the inseparable unity of the one truth and the multiple symbol. This is the core of Hinduism, basically. The lower, present and deluding mental Maya has first to be embraced, then to be overcome. The lower, present and deluding mental Maya has first to be embraced, then to be overcome. Because it is God's play with division and darkness and limitation, desire and strife and suffering, in which he subjects himself to the force that has come out of himself, and by her obscure suffers himself to be obscured. That was a confusing sentence. The lower, present and deluding mental Maya has first to be embraced, then to be overcome, because it is God's play with division and darkness and limitation, desire and strife and suffering, in which he subjects himself to the force that has come out of himself, and by her obscure suffers. I think there's some typo or spelling mistake. And by her obscure suffers himself to be obscured. That other Maya concealed by this mental has to be overpassed, then embraced, for it is God's play of the infinities of existence. That other Maya concealed by this mental has to be overpassed, then embraced, because it is in God's play of the infinities of existence, the splendors of knowledge, the glories of force mastered, and the ecstasies of love illimitable. The glories of force mastered, when you have mastered the glories of force, and the ecstasies of love are illimitable, that is where he emerges out of the hold of force, holds her instead, and fulfills in her illumined that for which she went out from him at the first place. This distinction between the lower and the higher Maya is the link in thought and in cosmic fact which the pessimistic and illusionist philosophies miss or neglect. That is an interesting name. He's calling them pessimistic and illusionist philosophies. So what is he saying about them? That this distinction between the lower and the higher Maya is the link, an important section. Lower and higher Maya, the link between this, the distinction between the lower and higher Maya is the link in thought and in cosmic fact. Which the pessimistic and illusionist philosophies miss or neglect. To them, the mental Maya, or perhaps an overmind, is the creatrix of the world, and a world created by mental Maya would indeed be an inexplicable paradox and a fixed yet floating nightmare of conscious existence, which could neither be classed as an illusion nor as a reality. We have to see that the mind is only an intermediate term between the creative governing knowledge and the soul imprisoned. we have to see that the mind is only an intermediate term between the creative governing knowledge and the soul imprisoned in its works. Satchidananda, involved by one of his lower movements in the self-oblivious absorption of force that is lost in the form of her own workings, returns towards himself out of the self-oblivion. Mind is only one of his instruments in the descent and the ascent. It is an instrument of the descending creation, not the secret creatrix. A transitional stage in the ascent, not our high original source and the consummate term of cosmic existence. Mind is only one of his instruments in the descent and the ascent. It is an instrument of the descending creation, not the secret creatrix. A transitional stage in the ascent, not our high original source and the consummate term of not the consummate term of cosmic existence. The philosophies which recognize mind alone as the creator of the worlds, or accept an original principle with mind as the only mediator between it and the forms of the universe, may be divided into the purely noumenal and the idealistic. The purely noumenal, Noumenal. The purely nominal recognize in the cosmos. Okay. The purely nominal, there's no comma in this sentence, so I couldn't figure it out. The purely nominal recognize in the cosmos only the work of mind, thought, idea. So the purely nominal people or philosophies, they recognize in the cosmos. What do they recognize in the cosmos? They recognize only the work of the mind, the work of the thought and idea. But idea may be purely arbitrary and have no essential relation to any real truth of existence. Of course, idea may be purely arbitrary. Such truth. Okay, this reminds me why Sitaram Goel used to say that after reading Aurobindo, he gave up on Western philosophy because Ram Swarup had used the word and he stuck with it, that Western philosophy is essentially cerebrations. You think it's an abstract in your mind and you think it and you solve it there. It's all in theory. There's no real life application. But, and Aurobindo is saying exactly that now. Idea may be purely arbitrary and have no essential relation to any real truth of existence. Such truth, if it exists, may be regarded as a mere absolute, aloof from all relations and aloof from all irreconcilable. Okay, this kind of thinking is a mere absolute, aloof from all relations, and it is also irreconcilable with a world of relations. The idealistic interpretation supposes a relation between the truth behind and the conceptive phenomenon in front, a relation which is not merely that of an antinomy and opposition. A relation which is not merely that of an antinomy and opposition. The view I am representing goes farther in idealism. It sees the creative idea as real idea, that is to say, a power of conscious force expressive of real being, born out of real being and partaking of its nature, and neither a child of the void nor a weaver of fictions. It is conscious reality throwing itself into mutable forms of its own imperishable and immutable substance. The world is therefore not a figment of conception in the universal mind, but a conscious birth of that which is beyond mind into forms of itself, obviously. A truth of conscious being supports these forms. A truth of conscious being supports these forms and expresses itself in them, and the knowledge corresponding to the truth thus expressed reigns as a not barish. Reigns means ruling. So a truth of conscious being supports these forms and expresses itself in them, and the knowledge corresponding to the truth thus expressed reigns as a supramental truth consciousness, organizing real ideas in a perfect harmony before they are cast into the mental vital material mold. Mind, life and body are an inferior consciousness and a partial expression which strives to arrive in the mold of a various evolution at that superior expression of itself already existent to the beyond mind. He makes a side note that I take the phrase from the Rig Veda, which Rita Chit, RTA-CIT, which means the consciousness of essential truth of being, or Satyam, consciousness of essential truth of being, Satyam, of ordered truth of active being, Ratam, and the Ratam, RTAM, order truth of active being, and the vast self-awareness or Brat, in which alone this consciousness is possible. Now we get back to the chapter. That which is in the beyond mind is the ideal which in its own conditions it is laboring to realize. From our ascending point of view, we may say that the real is behind all that exists. It expresses itself immediately in an ideal which is a harmonized truth of itself. The ideal throws out a phenomenal reality of variable conscious being which inevitably draws towards its own essential reality, tries at last to recover it entirely, whether by a violent leap or normally through the ideal which put it forth. It is this that explains the imperfect reality of human existence as seen by the mind, the instinctive aspiration in the mental being towards a perfectibility ever beyond itself, towards the concealed harmony of the ideal, and the supreme surge of the spirit beyond the ideal to the transcendental. The very facts of our consciousness, its constitution and its necessity, presuppose such a triple order. They negate the dual and irreconcilable antithesis of a mere absolute to a mere relativity. The very facts of our consciousness, its constitution and its necessity, presuppose such a triple order. They negate the dual and irreconcilable antithesis of a mere absolute to a mere relativity. Mind is not sufficient to explain existence in the universe. This is what I keep telling people and they don't listen. Mind is not sufficient to explain existence in the universe. Infinite consciousness must first translate itself into infinite faculty of knowledge, or as we call it from our point of view, omniscience. But mind is not a faculty of knowledge, nor an instrument of omniscience. It is a faculty for the seeking of knowledge, for expressing as much as it can gain of it, in certain forms of a relative thought, and for using it towards certain capacities of action. Even when it finds, it does not possess. Even when it finds, it does not possess. It only keeps a certain fund of current coin of truth, not truth itself. Only a fund of current coin of truth. So a little bit of the truth. In the bank of memory to draw upon according to its needs. For example, if you read a book, you are not going to remember every line. You are going to remember 3 or 4 core points and overall gist in that way. For mind is that which does not know, which tries to know, and which never knows except as in a glass darkly. It is the power which interprets truth of universal existence. It is the power which interprets truth of universal existence for the practical uses of a certain order of things. It is not the power which knows and guides that existence, and therefore it cannot be the power which created or manifested it. But if we suppose an infinite mind which would be free from our limitations, that at least might well be the creator of the universe. But if we suppose an infinite mind which would be free from our limitations, that at least might well be the creator of the universe. He's asking a question. But such a mind would be something quite different from the definition of mind as we know it. This is the problem with using English words for Indic concepts. But such a mind would be something quite different from the definition of mind as we know it. It would be something beyond mentality. It would be the supramental truth. An infinite mind, constituted in the terms of mentality as we know it, could only create an infinite chaos, a vast clash of chance, accident, vicissitude, wandering towards an indeterminate end, after which it would be always tentatively groping and aspiring. An infinite, omniscient, omnipotent mind would not be mind at all, but supramental knowledge. And that is what is considered mind in Vedanta and in Indic philosophies. So ideally what we should use, the phrase that we should use for the Indic concept of mind is this entire phrase called supramental knowledge. So just the word mind doesn't do justice to the concept of mind as understood by Sanatan Dharmis. Mind as we know it is a reflective mirror which receives presentations or images of a pre-existent truth or fact, either external to or at least vaster than itself. It represents to itself from moment to moment the phenomenon that is or has been. It possesses also the faculty of constructing in itself possible images other than those of the actual fact presented to it. That is to say, it represents to itself not only phenomenon that has been, but also phenomenon that may be. It cannot, be it noted, so keep in mind that it cannot represent to itself phenomenon that assuredly will be, except when it is an assured repetition of what it is or has been. It has finally the faculty of forecasting new modifications which it seeks to construct out of the meeting of what has been and what may be, out of the fulfilled possibility and the unfulfilled. Something that it sometimes succeeds in constructing more or less exactly. Sometimes fails to realize, but usually finds cast into other forms. Finds that thing represented into other forms than it forecasted. So what the forecast was, that maybe that this bookmark is a bookmark, but I see the bookmark represented in some other form. These are very simple examples. But usually finds cast into other forms than it forecasted and turned to other ends than it desired or intended. An infinite mind of this character might possibly construct an accidental cosmos of conflicting possibilities, and it might shape it into something shifting, something always transient, something ever uncertain in its drift, neither real nor unreal, possessed of no definite end or aim, but only an endless succession of momentary aims leading, since there is no superior directing power of knowledge, but only an endless succession of momentary aims leading eventually nowhither. Nihilism or illusionism, or some kindred philosophy, which kindred means any philosophy that could be said is in the family of these two philosophies. Nihilism and illusionism, or some kindred philosophy, is the only logical conclusion of such a pure nominalism. The cosmos so constructed would be a presentation. The cosmos so constructed would be a presentation or reflection of something not itself, but always and to the end a false representation, a distorted reflection. All cosmic existence would be a mind struggling to work out fully its imaginations but not succeeding, because they have no imperative basis of self-truth. Overpowered and carried forward by the stream of its own past energies. It would be borne onward. Indeterminately, forever without issue, unless or until it can either slay itself or fall into an eternal stillness. That trace to its roots is nihilism and illusionism, and it is the only wisdom if we suppose that our human mentality, or anything at all like it, represents the highest cosmic force and the original conception at work in the universe. I was saying universe, multiverse. That trace to its roots is nihilism and illusionism, and it is the only wisdom if we suppose that our human mentality, or anything at all like it, represents the highest cosmic force and the original conception at work in the universe. But the moment we find in the original power of knowledge a higher force than that which is represented by our human mentality, this conception of the universe becomes insufficient and therefore invalid. It has its truth, but it is not the whole truth. It is law of the immediate appearance of the universe, but not of its original truth and ultimate fact, because we perceive behind the action of mind, life and body something that is not embraced in the stream of force, but embraces and controls it, something that is not born into a world which it seeks to interpret, but has created in its being a world of which it has the omniscience, something that does not labor perpetually to form something else out of itself, while it drifts in the overmastering surge of past energies it can no longer control. while it drifts in the overmastering surge of past energies which it can no longer control, but has already in its consciousness a perfect form of itself, and is here gradually unfolding it. The world expresses a foreseen truth, obeys a predetermining will, realizes an original formative self-vision. This is an important sentence. The world expresses a foreseen truth, obeys a predetermining will, realizes an original formative self-vision. It is the growing image of a divine creation. So long as we work only through the mentality governed by the experiences, as long as we work only through the mentality governed by the appearances, this something beyond and behind and yet always immanent can be only an inference or a presence vaguely felt. We perceive a law of cyclic progress and infer an ever-increasing perfection of somewhat that is somewhere foreknown. Because everywhere we see law founded in self-being, and when we penetrate within into the rationale of its process, we find that law is the expression of an innate knowledge, a knowledge inherent by. Okay, here law means the framework by which the universe runs. Because everywhere we see law founded in self-being, and when we penetrate within into the rationale of its process, we find that law is the expression of an innate knowledge, a knowledge inherent in the existence, which is expressing itself and implied in the force that expresses it. And law developed by knowledge so as to allow of progression implies a divinely seen goal towards which the motion is directed. We see too that our reason seeks to emerge out of and dominate the helpless drift of our mentality, and we arrive at the perception that reason is only a messenger. What a great line. We arrive at the perception that reason is only a messenger, a representative or a shadow of a greater consciousness beyond itself, which does not need to reason, because it is all and knows all that it is, and we can then pass to the inference that this source of reason is identical with the knowledge that acts as law in the world. The source of reason is identical with the knowledge that acts as law in the world. This knowledge determines its own law sovereignly, because it knows what has been, is, and will be, and it knows because it is eternally and infinitely cognizes. Because it is eternally and infinitely cognizes itself. Being, that is infinite consciousness that is omnipotent force. This sentence is a bit complex. Being, which is infinite consciousness which is omnipotent force, when it makes a world, that is to say a harmony of itself. So when it makes that was a side note, I'll add it later. Being, that is infinite conscious that is omnipotent force, when it makes a world its object of consciousness, becomes seizable by our thought as a cosmic experience that knows its own truth and realizes in forms that which it knows, that is to say a harmony of itself. But it is only when we cease to reason and go deep into ourselves, into that secrecy where the activity of mind is stilled, that this other consciousness becomes really manifest to us. But it is only when we cease to reason and go deep into ourselves, into that secrecy where the activity of mind is stilled, that this other consciousness becomes really manifest to us. However imperfectly, owing to our long habit of mental reaction and mental limitation. However imperfectly, because of our long habit. Okay, let's read this again. that this other consciousness becomes really manifest to us. When? It is only when we cease to reason and go deep into ourselves, into that secrecy where the activity of mind is stilled, that this other consciousness becomes really manifest to us. No matter how imperfectly, because of our long habit of mental reaction and mental limitation. Then we can know surely in an increasing illumination that which we had uncertainly conceived. We can know surely that which we had uncertainly conceived by the pale and flickering light of reason. Knowledge waits seated beyond mind and intellectual reasoning. Knowledge waits seated beyond mind and intellectual reasoning, sitting on a throne. Knowledge is throned in the luminous vast of illimitable self-vision.